And so they established this community, but man had to listen to the voice, had to appease, had to say, okay, you demonic beings controlling this area, I want to establish my settlement here. And they had to work in tandem with those demonic beings to establish communities. And so now you see that communities, villages, centers, estates, or now what we call empires, nations, countries, whatever you call them, whether you call them emirates, you call them emirates, you call them whatever you call them, as human establishments, were done under the influence of Satan, under the influence of the fallen being. Because man kept on appeasing, man kept on listening to those fallen beings, or appeasing those fallen beings in order to establish communities, in order to establish centers, in order to establish villages, empires, in order to establish emirates, in order to establish almanacs, in order to establish sultanates, whatever name they call them, nations, countries, regions, whatever name they call them, man had to appease principalities and powers in those areas before they could grant them access to set up their communities in that area. And so this is why you see that almost all the communities, almost all the centers, almost all the empires, almost all the sultanates that were established under the direct supervision and influence of the fallen being, of Satan, of demons. And so they were the ones in control of that. So no particular community could organize without the direct influence of the one who allowed them to establish all those communities. That's the fallen man. That's why you see all those ancestral worship, all those idols. No particular community that was not established under the supervision or under the influence of demons and devils. So that's why in these communities, right from the beginning, whether if you call them in the days of Abraham, whatever you call them, in the days of the father of Abraham, in all of Chad, wherever you call them, they were all idols all over. They worship idols because those communities were established at the influence or under the influence of demonic beings. And so they had to worship all those demonic beings. That's why you see the establishment of idols across these empires, across these nations, across these communities, across these villages, whatever you call them, across these nations. No nation, no village, no community, no emirate, no almanate, no countries were established without the direct influence of satanic beings. And so they were the ones. And so you could see them setting up shrines, setting up idols, setting up, whether they call them idols, they could see them, whether they could say, oh, we are setting up these idols to worship God. No, they were not worshiping God with all those idols. They were only using those idols, using those shrines, using those oracles to still communicate with the fallen man, because with the fallen beings, demons and devils, who allowed them access to establish those communities. So empires were established by demons. Empires were established by human beings under the influence of satanic beings. No empire, no nation, no community was established without the direct influence and supervision of the fallen beings, of demonic beings. That's what we see on the surface of the earth. And so you see that. So now, being under the influence of Satan, under the influence of demonic beings, cultural values, cultural systems, cultural structures were all established to please demonic beings. Were all established under the influence of demonic beings, under the influence of demons and devils. Political systems, whether you call them monarchy, whether you call them monarchical system of government, fascism, whatever you call them, totalitarianism, whatever system you call them, they were all under the influence of demonic beings. For what? For the survival of human beings. Economic systems were all established under the direct influence of Satan. Whether economic system, whether you call them subsistence, whether you call them whatever you call them, whether you call them agricultural subsistence or whatever, they were all established for the survival of human beings under the influence of demonic beings, under the influence of Satan. Commercial establishment, financial establishment, agricultural establishment, whatever you name them, all this commercial, all this business market, there is no market, there is no business, there is no commerce, there is no financial systems and structures that are not under the direct influence of demons and devils. No system, no commercial system. They were all under the direct influence of demons and devils. There is no religion that is not under the direct influence of demons and devils. No political reign, no political systems and structures that you could say that are not under the influence of demons and devils. All political systems and structures. They were all social systems and structures were all under the direct influence of demons and devils. That's why initially polygamy was allowed. But later on, as man moved on, they wanted to dance to the tune of, it's no longer allowed. Before, for the survival of human beings, for the survival of man on the surface of the earth, polygamy was allowed. That means a situation where man could marry many wives. Okay? And it was allowed that, women could also go into other practices of in getting involved in more than one man. It was allowed. They were all allowed. They were all allowed at the beginning because the social systems and structures for the survival of mankind allow for that under the influence of demons and devils. Because man has polluted. It was not the plan of man, the plan of procreation. It was not the plan of God that man should have the same procreation that man is getting involved in. That's why under the influence of the devil, man had this procreation. Man had this system of procreation that we have on the surface of the earth. So at the beginning, polygamy was allowed. At the beginning, it's not even that polygamy was allowed. Polygamy was cherished as a way of man's survival. The sister could marry sister, uncle could marry uncle. No wonder people could say, why was it that Isaac, for example, I'm giving an example, why was it that Isaac in the Bible, Abraham had to direct him back to his own lineage to marry? Why was it allowed? Why did God allow that? They say, God allowed that. No, it was not that God allowed that. It was man's own choosing. It was man's own dictate under the influence of the devil. And so all those things were allowed. David that married many wives, they were allowed. Why was it allowed? Because it was all systems and structures controlled, social systems and structures controlled by the devil. And so those things were allowed. They were allowed. They were means of survival, existential survival, devised by man under the influence of the devil. Military adventurism, allowed. And so, why we say now, when you talk about wars of conquest, these were when man started increasing on the surface of the earth. When man started increasing on the surface of the earth, wars of conquest came in. You could not hear of wars of conquest at the early stage. You could not hear of wars of. It was when man started spreading and started expanding that you now see communities developing here and there, and man extending to Europe, from Africa, man extending to Europe, man extending to Asia, man extending to other parts of the world. There were no Asians at that time. Man extending to other parts of the world. And even these communities that were established after some time, as population grew, they saw the need to also expand. Though that led them to war. That led them to clash with other communities that were already established. And so this is what we saw at the beginning. And now, even as you see the journey back, what Europe did to Africa, for example, that was the journey. I said we had two journeys: the journey of expansion and the journey of spread from Africa to the rest of the world. And you see the journey of discovery when Europe came back to Africa. Apart from the fact that communities expanded and led to wars, whatever, then there were wars of nations, organized empires that were fought against other organized empires. That's what we now see Europe coming to Africa as organized and taking over. Why could Europe, why did they as organized empire come to it? It was also the need for existential survival. They needed to survive. The inhabitants of Europe needed to survive. The inhabitants of Asia needed to survive. Even as at now, as we talk, that desire for existential survival is in full force. That's why you have nations rising up against nations. If you see, for example, empires of America, like the American empires trying to subjugate other empires, what's that? It's the desire for existential survival. If you see, for example, nations fighting against nations, what's that? If you look at the deep root of it, the deep cause of it, is all the desire for existential survival. A desire for expansion and desire for existential survival. That no, these nations should be under us. So we will control not only them, it's not only controlling the human beings, no, because what's the need? Are you controlling human beings in Africa? No, it was the desire to tap the resources, to exploit the resources in those areas for these other ones to survive. That's the desire for existential survival. If you see that we are at the brink of war, at the brink of another third world war, First World War fought, Second World War fought, and we're at the brink of Third World War. What's the need?